We end with a milestone in the extraordinary effort to bring back the North American bison. For centuries, they were vital to indigenous life until they were driven to the brink of extinction about 200 years ago.
In 1870, a hunter west of Spirit Lake, Iowa, raised his rifle at the last two wild bison in the state. He fired,
blocking the Great Ranges and rendering it impossible for scarcely a single bison to escape.
For the next 138 years, not a single bison hoof touched Iowa soil. The prairie they had shaped over 10,000 years began to collapse. Ecologists tried seeds, controlled burns, fencing. The land refused to cooperate. Something was missing, something with 4 legs, 50 pounds of dung a day, and a rolling habit nobody had thought to replace. Today we discuss what 28 animals did to a dead landscape, and why the scientists watching it could barely believe what they were writing down. The empire that vanished overnight. In the summer of 1872, the American plains were something that most living people today would not recognize as real. Somewhere between 30 million and 60 million bison moved across a corridor stretching from Texas to Canada, herds so vast that travelers reported watching them pass for 3 days without a break in the flow. Iowa sat at the eastern edge of this empire. 85% of the state was covered in tallgrass prairie, some of it standing 6 feet high in the summer months, with root systems plunging 15 feet into soil so dense and carbon-rich that it had no rival in the western world outside the wind-blown Loess deposits along the Missouri River Valley. That same year, 1872, a federal program quietly began what would become one of the fastest ecological destructions in recorded history. The systematic slaughter of the North American bison was not accidental. It was deliberate, encouraged, and in some cases subsidized. Within 18 years, a population estimated at 60 million had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 animals across the entire continent.
A herd of bison on the move across the prairie. As many as 60 million of these majestic animals, also known as American buffalo.
The speed of that collapse is almost impossible to process. A species that had shaped the land for 10,000 years was functionally gone in under 2 decades. What does it actually mean to lose 60 million bison from a landscape? Most people, when they think about extinction-level loss, imagine the absence of the animal itself, fewer creatures to see, a gap in the food chain. But the scientists who began studying the Iowa prairie system in the 1980s came to understand something far more unsettling. The bison had not merely lived in the tallgrass prairie, they had built it. By the time Iowa's agricultural conversion was complete, less than 0.1% of the original prairie survived. Not 10%, not 1%, 0.1%. The National Park Service today classifies the tallgrass prairie as one of the most endangered ecosystems on the planet, more endangered than tropical rainforest, more endangered than coral reef. A landscape the size of Texas had been reduced to scattered fragments smaller than most suburban parks, preserved almost by accident in fence lines, road margins, and old cemeteries where the plow had never reached. By the early 1990s, a small group of ecologists in Iowa had been trying to restore these fragments for years. They had fenced land, planted native seeds, reintroduced controlled burns on historical schedules.
In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act required museums, including those in the national parks, to return excavated remains to their cultural descendants.
And they had watched the land refuse to cooperate. The wildflower diversity stayed flat. The insect populations did not recover the way the models suggested they should. The vegetation structure remained wrong, too uniform, too dense in some places, too sparse in others. Something was missing, and its absence had a shape. It would take another decade before they understood what they were looking at. The prairie wasn't just missing an animal, it was missing its architect, and without the architect, the building kept falling down. But understanding what was missing and being able to replace it were 2 entirely different problems, and the plan that would eventually come together was not something anyone expected to work as fast as it did. The day the bison came home. In 1992, the Nature Conservancy quietly purchased the first parcel of what would eventually become the Broken Kettle Grasslands Preserve in Plymouth County, the far northwestern corner of Iowa, where the state's geography turns strange. The land sits in the Loess Hills, a geological formation that does not exist at this scale anywhere else on Earth, except one region of northern China. The hills were not carved by rivers or shaped by glacial gouging. They were blown into existence. As the last ice age retreated, its glaciers left behind vast outwash plains of powdered silt particles so fine and so dry that the wind picked them up and stacked them, over thousands of years, into ridges deep enough to define the entire western edge of Iowa. Stand on top of a loose ridge at Broken Kettle, and the soil beneath your feet is a deposit that took 10,000 years to arrive. It is, in every meaningful sense, irreplaceable. What the Nature Conservancy purchased was not pristine prairie. It was land that had been grazed, fragmented, and colonized by eastern red cedar, a native tree that, in the absence of fire, spreads fast enough to close over an open grassland in a single generation.
They maintain the prairie by eating the grass like furry lawnmowers that swallow what they cut.
For 16 years, from 1992 to 2008, the Conservancy worked the land without any bison at all. Teams removed cedar by hand and by machine. Prescribed burns were reintroduced on schedules modeled from historical fire records, the rhythm that lightning and indigenous burning had maintained across the plains for millennia before suppression policies ended it. Fencing was reinforced across the full perimeter. And through all of it, baseline ecological conditions were documented obsessively, season by season, so that whatever happened next could be measured against something real. The Conservancy's Director of Lands described the philosophy that held all of this together in a single line that became an internal motto. They did not have the prairie for the bison, they had the bison for the prairie. The animals were never the destination. They were the instrument. But the bison they were preparing to bring in could not be just any bison. This is the part of the story that the headline version almost always leaves out, and it matters more than most people realize. The vast majority of bison in North America today carry some degree of cattle DNA.
Dr. Barfield says the threat of bison gradually shedding their genetic DNA can be stopped through several different ways, so they'll be able to withstand disease and climate changes.
During the near-extinction period of the late 1800s, when the continental population had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 animals scattered across the continent, ranchers and conservationists intermixed bison with cattle in an attempt to preserve whatever genetics they could. The animals survived. But the genetic purity of the original plains bison did not, in most cases, survive with them. Studies examining North American herds suggest that the majority carry at least some hybridization. Finding animals that did not would turn out to be extraordinarily difficult. The source the Nature Conservancy eventually identified was Lame Johnny Creek Ranch in South Dakota, a private herd whose bloodline traced directly back to Wind Cave National Park, one of the only bison populations on the continent considered reliably free of cattle hybridization. 28 animals were selected. In the fall of 2008, they were loaded onto livestock trailers and driven south and east across the state line into Iowa. The drive itself, a few hours on Prairie Highway, covered a distance that would have taken their ancestors several days of slow movement through open grassland. The world those ancestors had moved through no longer existed. What waited at the end of the drive was 2,000 acres of restored Lewis Hills and a gate that had never been opened for anything like them before. On a cool October afternoon, the gates opened. The herd did not rush. They stood at the threshold for a long moment, the way animals always pause at a boundary they have never crossed. And then, one by one, they moved forward. Onto soil no bison had touched since the men who fought the Civil War were still alive. Nobody watching that afternoon knew what the next 12 years would produce. Some of the ecologists present suspected the results would take a full generation to appear. Some thought it might take a century. What they could not have known, standing in the October grass watching 28 animals disappear over a Los Ridge, was that the prairie had not forgotten what they were and that it was already beginning to remember. What bison build? To understand what 28 bison did to Broken Kettle grasslands, it helps to first understand what cattle do to a pasture, because for most of the people watching that herd walk through the trailer gates, cattle were the only reference point they had for large grazing animals on American land. Cattle, when turned onto a pasture, graze almost uniformly. They show a strong preference for broadleaf wildflowers, what ecologists call forbs.
Weekly wildflower report from the Iowa DNR. Right now, early spring flowers are just starting to pop up.
And they move across available land in patterns that tend toward evenness. The result? over time, is a pasture that looks neat, cropped, and consistent, which is exactly what livestock management is designed to produce. Bison do almost the exact opposite. They graze grasses with intense preference, largely ignoring the wildflowers that cattle destroy first, and they do not distribute themselves evenly. They graze in concentrated patches, hammering one section of prairie hard for several days, then moving on and not returning to that spot for weeks or months. The area they have just left is grazed down to the soil. The area 50 feet away is completely untouched. The area beyond that is somewhere in between. What this creates across thousands of acres and decades of movement is what ecologists call habitat heterogeneity, a patchwork, a mosaic, intensely grazed zones sitting immediately beside, lightly grazed zones sitting immediately beside completely ungrazed zones, all in constant rotation as the herd moves and returns and moves again. Why does that patchwork matter so much? Because different species of plants require different conditions to germinate, establish, and thrive. A wildflower that needs bare, disturbed soil cannot compete in a dense grass stand. A grass species that requires partial shade from taller neighbors cannot survive in an open, cropped zone. When every inch of a prairie is grazed to the same depth at the same time, only the most competitive generalist species survive. When the landscape is constantly shifting between intensity levels, some areas overgrazed, some untouched, everything in between, hundreds of specialist species find the precise conditions they need within a short walk of each other. That is the difference between a meadow and a prairie, and it is a difference that no amount of seed planting or fire management can fully replicate without the animal that creates it. Then there are the wallows. A bison does not just graze, it rolls. Adults of both engage in wallowing behavior, throwing themselves onto the ground and rolling for 10 to 15 minutes at a time.
The types of grasses that flourished there, and the other species that thrived alongside the buffalo.
Grinding the soil with their full weight and creating shallow circular depressions. A single bison may return to the same wallow site dozens of times across a single summer. The resulting depression, typically 8 to 12 feet across and several inches deep, does something entirely unexpected when the spring rains arrive. It fills with water. And in a landscape that was originally defined by small, scattered wetlands before the drainage tiles went in, those wallow depressions become miniature ecosystems. Researchers at Yellowstone have documented more than 100 plant species that preferentially grow in or around bison wallow species that grow nowhere else on the surrounding prairie. Historically, millions of these wallow depressions dotted the Great Plains from Texas to Canada, creating a constellation of microhabitats that supported extraordinary biodiversity across the entire grassland system. At Broken Kettle, the wallows began appearing within the first 2 years, but there was another transformation happening at ground level, one that most visitors to the preserve would have stepped over without noticing, and one that turned out to be central to everything that followed. A single adult bison produces up to 50 pounds of dung daily, across 28 animals and eventually hundreds that accumulates fast. But the dung itself is not waste in any meaningful ecological sense. It is a habitat. Studies in peer-reviewed entomology journals have documented as many as 300 different insect species associated with a single bison dung pat, not across a season. In a single pat, the diversity of beetles, flies, and specialist dung-feeding insects that bison dung supports has no equivalent in cattle operations, partly because of differences in bison diet, partly because of the nature of the dung itself, and partly because cattle operations typically apply the kind of anti-parasitic medications that sterilize dung as a biological resource before it even hits the ground. The insects brought the birds, and the birds, particularly the grassland specialists whose populations had been collapsing for decades, were the species most conservation biologists had stopped expecting to see in Iowa again. What they documented over the next 5 years at Broken Kettle would require them to update their expectations entirely. The numbers no one expected. By 2012, just 4 years after the release, ecologists working at Broken Kettle were documenting measurable changes in wildflower diversity, not the marginal, ambiguous signals that prairie restoration projects typically produce in early years. Measurable changes, visible to field survey teams without specialized equipment. By 2015, researchers affiliated with Iowa State University and partner institutions were publishing studies confirming what the field observations had been suggesting for 2 years. Bison reintroduction was doubling plant diversity at Broken Kettle, not incrementally increasing it, not pushing it toward the positive end of a confidence interval, doubling it. The landmark study came in 2022, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, arguably the most rigorous peer-reviewed venue in American science. The research analyzed bison reintroduction data across multiple sites and found that native plant species richness had increased by 103% at local scales and by 86% at the catchment scale. Those gains had continued accumulating for 29 years at the longest-running sites, and they had proven resilient holding through the most severe drought in 4 decades without collapsing back toward baseline. The study also compared bison reintroduction outcomes against cattle grazing under restoration conditions. Cattle grazing did increase native plant diversity compared to no grazing at all, but it did so by less than half as much. The difference between a bison and a cow, in terms of ecological outcome, is not minor. It is the difference between meaningful recovery and marginal improvement. What does a 103% increase in native plant species richness actually look like on the ground? It looks like the Henslow sparrow. The Henslow sparrow is a small, secretive grassland bird that requires very specific structural conditions to nest successfully, a mix of dense, tall grass for cover and shorter, more open areas for foraging, all within a small territory. It had been considered locally extirpated from most Iowa prairie sites before the Broken Kettle reintroduction. By the 5th year of the bison program, biologists were documenting Henslow sparrows in survey areas where they had not been recorded in decades. The patchy grazing structure the bison had created, the precise mosaic of dense and open areas in close proximity, had produced the exact habitat architecture the bird needed. No management plan written by a human ecologist had been able to replicate it. The bison did it without a plan. The pollinator recovery at Broken Kettle added another dimension to the story. Native bee diversity, which had been declining across agricultural Iowa for decades, alongside the wildflower diversity that bee populations depend on, began showing measurable increases in bison-grazed areas compared to ungrazed restoration sites at the same preserve. The mechanism was direct. More wildflower species, blooming across more of the growing season because bison grazing staggered the flowering windows of different plant communities, meant more food sources distributed across more of the year. And the insects that came for the flowers brought still more birds, which brought predators, which restructured yet another layer of the ecological web the prairie had once sustained. By 2020, 12 years after the original trailer gates opened at Broken Kettle, the herd had grown from 28 animals to 275, a nearly 10-fold increase in a population that arrived with no certainty it would survive its first winter on restored land. The Nature Conservancy began conducting annual roundups, partly for veterinary care, partly to manage herd density against the carrying capacity of the 2,000-acre enclosure. The surplus animals did not go to slaughter. They went elsewhere to other restoration sites, and increasingly, through a partnership with the Intertribal Buffalo Council, to indigenous communities whose relationship with the Plains bison predates American settlement by thousands of years. Since 2020, more than 2,300 bison from Conservancy preserves have been returned to native nations across the country. The animal that built the prairie was also simultaneously being restored to the people whose cultures it had shaped. In 2024, the United States Department of the Interior announced more than $25 million from the Inflation Reduction Act dedicated to bison restoration across federal lands. The accompanying secretary's order directed bureaus across the federal government to use the best available science and indigenous knowledge in planning bison recovery. 28 animals released onto 2,000 acres of Iowa hills in 2008 had, in 16 years, helped reshape national policy. The question was no longer whether bison could restore a prairie. The question, the one that no study had yet fully answered, was how much prairie they could restore and how long it would take to find out. The 1,000-year project. Jim Pease, a wildlife biologist and professor emeritus at Iowa State University, has spent decades watching prairie restoration. Efforts succeed partially and fail partially and inch forward in ways that rarely make headlines. When asked about the Broken Kettle project's timeline, Pease has described it as a 1,000-year project, not metaphorically. not as an expression of pessimism. As a genuine scientific assessment of how long it takes for a fully functional tallgrass prairie ecosystem, with its complete complement of plant species, insect communities, soil microbiomes, bird populations, and large mammal dynamics to reconstitute itself from near zero. The bison have accelerated the process in ways that surprised everyone. But acceleration is not the same as completion. The early results at the Nakusa grasslands in Illinois, a parallel bison reintroduction launched in 2014, illustrated exactly the kind of patience this work demands. Initial surveys in the first 5 years found no statistically significant differences in plant diversity, composition, or vegetation structure between bison-grazed and ungrazed plots. Nothing measurable. Critics who had been skeptical of the bison reintroduction model pointed to those early Nakusa numbers as evidence that the Iowa results might be overstated. But the Nakusa data kept coming in, and in subsequent years, the statistically significant changes the early surveys had not found began appearing, accumulating, and compounding. The prairie was not refusing to respond. It was operating on its own timeline, the one it had always used, measured not in grant cycles or quarterly reports, but in decades and centuries. The geographic isolation problem at Broken Kettle remains the most honest limitation in the story. 2,000 acres is a meaningful restoration site. It is not a functioning ecosystem in the fullest sense. A genetically healthy bison population over the long term requires connectivity to other herds, the kind of gene flow that, historically, occurred when tens of millions of animals moved freely across thousands of miles. The agricultural landscape surrounding Broken Kettle makes natural dispersal essentially impossible. The land on every side is locked into row crop production, corn and soybeans, in patterns that are economically rational for individual landowners in ways that no conservation incentive has yet been able to fully compete with. Expanding the footprint of protected tallgrass prairie in Iowa is not a scientific challenge. It is an economic and political one, and it does not have a solution on any near-term horizon that is currently visible. And then, in May of 2026, something happened at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, the sister bison reintroduction site to Broken Kettle, established in 1996, recognized in 2024 by a panel convened by USA Today as the best national wildlife refuge in the entire United States out of 570 candidates that no one had planned for. A white bison calf was born.
The white bison calf entered the world last Friday at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge in Prairie City.
According to National Park Service documentation, white bison occur in approximately 1 in 1 million births in wild populations. The refuge manager, Scott Gilge, was careful in his public statements. He described it simply as something very special for the indigenous communities involved in the wider bison restoration movement. In Lakota Sioux and Dakota tradition, the birth of a white bison calf is considered sacred, a sign that significant change is approaching, that the world is turning towards something it had lost. The tradition is not a superstition. It is a record, passed through generations of people whose relationship with the plains bison long predates the written documentation that Western science relies on. What they knew about this animal, what it meant for a landscape, what its presence signaled about the health of the world around it, is now being confirmed, piece by piece, in peer-reviewed journals. The white calf at Neil Smith carried weight that no study design could capture and no metric could fully express. The Broken Kettle herd today is genetically pure. Its descendants represent one of the most ecologically and genetically valuable populations of plains bison in North America. The land they graze has produced some of the most thoroughly documented tallgrass prairie restoration outcomes anywhere on the continent. The ecologists who designed the project in 2008 did not know what would happen. They hoped, they prepared, they watched, and they documented, year after year, a land doing something that most of their models had told them would take far longer. The prairie did not recover because humans managed it perfectly. It recovered because something was returned to it that it had been waiting for, an animal that does not merely live in a landscape but actively, continuously, invisibly builds one. Whether that is enough, whether 2,000 acres and 275 animals can hold the line for 1,000 more years, is a question that no one alive today will see answered. But somewhere in the Los Hills of Plymouth County, Iowa, in a patch of land that by every historical measure should not exist, The grass is 6 feet high in July. The wallows fill with water every spring. The Henslow sparrow is nesting where it had not nested in living memory, and a white calf is standing in a field that its ancestors last saw when Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Something is being rebuilt here, slowly, stubbornly, against every economic pressure and every agricultural incentive that surrounds it on all sides. Something is coming back. In 1870, that hunter believed he was closing a chapter. He was wrong. 138 years of silence. 28 animals stepping off a trailer into land their ancestors last touched during the Civil War. Plant diversity that doubled. A sparrow returning from local extinction. A white calf, 1 in a million, standing in grass that had forgotten what it was built to be. The prairie did not recover because humans managed it perfectly. It recovered because something was returned that it had been waiting for. Hit like if this moved you. Comment: can rewilding actually scale, or is this a 1,000-year project? Subscribe next week. Wolves return to Scotland, and the rivers start moving.